the Zoom link to make sure that makes the most sense. So these are famous quintuplets of the 50s. And of course, the third house is the house of siblings. So if you're wondering why I have a picture of a bunch of children that all look the same, that's the main reason that I chose this. So, you know, the third house is one of those houses that modern astrology has really transmuted. And it's transmuted it as per what we call the zodiac alphabet. So it's basically made the zodiac alphabet the primary meaning of the third house. In other words, Aries equals first house, Taurus equals second house, Gemini equals third house. So almost all the time, like whenever I'm on Reddit and anybody talks about third house, the word communication comes up, you know, how you do things mentally, etc. And in Vedic astrology, there's a little bit of that. As we talked last week, you know, Vedic astrology has been using using that zodiac alphabet for the past, 1,000, 3,000 years. So it's the way that they seam it in to the actual meanings makes a lot more sense, and the system it kind of fits in with the rest of the system. However, what I tended to notice is that we don't really start seeing people say Gemini is the third house, Cancer is the fourth house, etc. We don't start seeing that really until Lily's time. So not really until the 17th century. So by that time, you know, astrology has been around for years, thousands of years, and the astrology, you know, that we are diaspora from Iran and from Saudi Arabia, it had been 1,700 years or maybe 1,000 years, you know, up to that point that there was no kind of connection with the zodiac and the third house. As a matter of fact, I think we even saw this last week when we looked at Mars. The whole connection to the third house was Mars, right? Because Mars was the third in the order of the Chaldean order, and Mars, you know, so this whole thing was the third house was connected to Mars, and that was why he is the significator for male siblings, for brothers. And so that is kind of where we will go with the third house this particular time. It won't be communication. It won't be, it can be the hands, of course, and what we do with our hands. And we'll see a little bit of it, of some of the things connected to it, like maybe post and things like that. But ultimately, there's going to be a few other things that we will see that kind of consistently come up. So this is from the 12th house session that we did. And once again, I just wanted to kind of bring in mind that cadent houses were considered among the weakest. And so if we remember, and of course, Layla Akbar was with me for all of the Bonatti 146 considerations that we did, sessions that we did. And one of the main things that kind of came up during those sessions was how much angular planets really meant. How, you know, the strength that angular planets really had, the strength that a succeeding planet had, and you can see here powerful, medium, weak, and how much of an impediment it was considered for a planet to be placed in a cadent house. So that goes with this concept of advancement, which we have talked about ad nauseum. So a planet is in a state of advancement if it's angular or succeedent. It's in a state of retreat if it is in a cadent house. And so you can see all of the different things here determining the strength in any situation. In cadent house, it's weak. If you're looking for a lost object, it's the furthest away. Likelihood of discovery, it's the least possible. Timing, it's the slowest. Matters of price, it will be the lowest. Matters of health and illness suggests a lack of vitality and argues in favor of illness or death, right? Because the strength to overcome the disease is not helped, or is not really there, because cadent planets are weak. So just something, so indeed, the third house is a cadent house. And generally, remember when we were looking at, was it Mercury? When we first did the Mercury in traditional astrology one, we were looking at almost all of these, we were looking at all these different writers. We looked at Hemingway, we looked at Charles Dickens, we looked at a bunch of other writers, and we noticed that in almost every case, the Mercury was in a cadent house. And often the Mercury was in the 12th house, which of course makes perfect sense because you need to be doing your writing in solitude. So I found that that was a very interesting thing. So especially when you think, I mean, even though being a writer is what the person is known for, the writing itself happens away from view. And so ultimately, cadent houses happen away from the strongest light, right? The strongest light are the angles, and then the succeedent, and then the weakest light is the cadent. And if you think about the 12th house, the 12th house, the sun is in the 12th house after it rises. And so there's that period of almost 2 hours where you can't really see the sun and right after it rises. You can see it when it rises. It's beautiful. It's amazing. And then there's this time when you can't really see it until maybe about 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning. And then all of a sudden you see it again. And so that is also kind of how the 12th house kind of shows up as a cadent house. So third house, one of the things that we understand about the third house is that it's goddess. And I've been saying this for a while, and I've been warning you that I'm going to do it. But many of the charts that we're going to look at are the charts of movie goddesses, right? So we're going to look at the charts of famous women and movie goddesses to see if there is third house stuff. So let's kind of go through it. So she starts. This is from Deborah Holding's book, the Houses, Temples of the Sky, which is the best book in my opinion on the houses. It's not a big long book. But it goes into, as you can see, it starts with Menelaus, who's 4th century, and goes all the way to the modern idea. So this gives us an idea, or shows us how every house, the meanings rather of every house have developed over time. So Menelaus says the fortunes and fates of brothers, and it's the temple of the moon, right? Because it is known as the what? The joy of the moon, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Then, of course, brothers, friends, and relatives, wealth. Now, I haven't really seen that. Messages, goddess, of course, it was called goddess. Royalty, slaves, or travel. Royalty in that goddess also represented queen. So in the Hellenistic period, instead of the 10th house representing king and kingdom, the 9th house represented king and kingdom. And so the third being the 7th from the 9th. And at some point, we're going to do derivative houses, and we'll look at that. We'll do a session on derivative houses, and it's so the 7th from the 9th would be the wife of the king, and who would be the queen. And so I think that that's where that comes from. Now, slaves I don't recall seeing in any of the things that I put in today. But travel definitely, but not the same kind of travel as 9th house travel, which might be by oversea. This would be travel by road on land. And one of the charts we're going to look at is the chart of a country and western singer by the name of Willie Nelson. And Willie Nelson wrote this very famous song called "On the Road Again." And we're going to actually look at that chart and see where that might come from. So brothers and sisters and friends, this is from Micah. He's about 5th century, maybe 6th century. Brothers, sisters, and friends, travelers, favorable because it aspects the ascendant by sextile, called Dea or goddess. Al-Biruni, brothers, sisters, relations. You can see it's all pretty much consistent. Relation, in-laws. That's something I learned today. In-laws. That the third house is connected to in-laws because it's relations in general. It's basically. So, for instance, if you were to say, where would I find my cousin in the chart? You would look at the third house. You would look at the exact same house that you would look for brothers. So siblings, relations. Now you could even do it like if you said, oh, where's my aunt? Now, of course, your aunt is obviously the sibling of your mother or father. So if it's father, we're using 4th house for father, then you could look at the 6th house for the father's sibling, but you could also look at the 3rd house because it's relations in general. Kin and neighbors. Okay, so kin. Right, your kin, right? Those are the people that you're related to, and neighbors. This is Lily. Smaller inland journeys. So now we can see. Oh, in short journeys, we can see how short journeys with Al-Biruni. Jewels. See what wealth, jewels. Now I haven't seen any of that stuff I haven't seen any of that stuff. Now I wonder where that kind of comes from, because I really haven't. In none of the examples that I've seen that I'm using have I seen jewels or wealth. Friends, mitigation, short journeys, kin and neighbors, smaller inland journeys, the short journeys thing. We're going to look at people that have spent a lot of life on the road. We're bringing back Ella Fitzgerald because she spent so much of her life on the road. And then we're going to look at Willie Nelson too. Letters, rumors, reports, and messages. Look at how it's starting to, remember, what did I just say? We start to see this Gemini equals third house thing with Lily, with the 17th century astrologers, and letters, rumors, reports, and messages. All of that stuff connects to, because remember, Gemini represents gossip, right? And represents any kind of dissemination of information. And so here we come to the modern thing, which is family and school life. And when we talked about the ninth house initially back in our traditional astrology course, then we saw that family, that school, that all education, teachers, all teachers and all students were actually given to the ninth house. Whereas now we look at the primary school education as the third, and the ninth house education as the, rather the long, like the, what do they call it? The higher education as the ninth house. Short journeys, communications, boom, there we are. Speech, mind, environment, self-expression, right? All of that stuff is as a result of connecting Gemini to the third house. So, and connecting Mercury to the third house. But what we also know is that Mars was the true significator of the third house. And what's interesting, I just want to do a little segue for a second. What's interesting about Vedic astrology is that the third house in Vedic astrology is called the house of initiatives. It represents actions and initiatives. And so it's called, basically it represents what it is you're going to do, what you're inclined to do, what action you're inclined to do. And we know that Mars is the planet that represents action. And so that's a very big difference between Western astrology third house and the third house that's represented by Vedic astrology, or as represented by Vedic astrology. This is from Deborah Holding. So she says, for symbolic purposes, it was also appropriate to associate the moon with the third house and not the fourth. The fourth was connected with death, right? We've talked, when we looked at the fourth house, we saw that it's the actual grave. It's because it's called the subterranean, right? So it's the 6 feet under house. With death, which is why Menelaus called it the Temple of Saturn. And remember that Saturn represents things in the ground, agriculture, the working of the land, right? The great reaper. And of course, Saturn is also the significator for death. But from the process of death, life resumed again under the influence of the moon, whose links with fertility were obvious. The moon was the personification of the great goddess, which she of course is, whose essence pervaded the earth, offering, and we think of things like Mother Nature, Earth Mother, etc., right? So that's the moon. And what sign is she exalted in? Earth sign Taurus. Accordingly, the third house was called Dea, meaning goddess, in the words of Ptolemy. So here we go all the way back to Ptolemy. Ptolemy, the moon as the heavenly body nearest the earth, bestows her effluence most abundantly upon mundane things. For most of them, animate or inanimate, are sympathetic to her and change in company with her. The rivers increase and diminish their streams with her light. The seas turn their own tides with her rising and settings, and plants and animals in whole or in some part wax and wane with her. A friend of mine told me that she used to work in a mental institution, in a mental hospital. And she said that every full moon was always crazy. And remember that the word lunacy comes from a lunatic, or lunacy comes from the Latin term luna, right, which means moon. In traditional astrology, philosophy of the moon represents the mundane element world, the animal spirit, or spirit of the earth. In astronomy, the earth and the moon hold a special relationship together. They form a binary system with a shared center of gravity that lies within the body of Earth. Sorry for that misspelling. Our ancestors were aware of the integrated relationships between the two bodies because of the obvious influence of the moon cycles and its corresponding effect upon tribal and cultural concerns and matters of community. As a consequence, it is not out of place to find the moon. Sorry about all this stuff that I was doing here. Oh, we've got a question. Our immediate neighbor in space, remember third house, people working in ER say the same. Full moon equals crazy people. Yes, absolutely. And remember, the moon represents the common people, the public, So that's another thing. So that's another reason that it could affect the common people. It's the commonwealth. So and look at that. So as a consequence, it's not out of place to find the moon, our immediate neighbor in space, governing a house that relates to our immediate environment. And also the third house is the house of neighbors, so the people who are your neighbor. This is from Valens. If the moon is in this place, now for the third house, he basically only talked about whatever planet you find there. But I thought that this would be useful since it's called the place of the goddess moon. If the moon is in this place, it is assigned the ascendant or the lot, and is in its proper face. The native will be great. Don't ask me what proper face means. I'm not exactly. We're not talking about face as far as essential dignity. There's another thing, but I'm not exactly 100% sure. The native will be great. That's for you, Christopher, because I know you'd be curious and be like, oh, what does it mean by face? The native will be great and a master of many good things. He will rule a city. He will give orders to many men. He will be obeyed, and he will be master of treasures. Now, we are going to look at the chart of Mae West, who has, who by whole sign has the moon in Cancer in the third house with the part of fortune. Right, and so look at what this says. If the moon is in this place, is assigned the ascendant or the lot, and is in its proper, the native will be great and a master of many good things. And she had a humongous reputation. She owned most of Los Angeles. He will rule a city. He will give orders to many men. Remember, she's kind of like the female super alpha. And she will be obeyed and will be master of treasuries. And she was one of the richest people. She was super, super rich by the time she died. Here we start with Abu Mashar now, the third siblings and bloodkin. Okay, so your relatives, when you go to a family reunion, that's a third house event. And the relatives of the wife, there's the in-laws. So when you're dealing with your just no mother-in-law, you're dealing with the third house. And it is also over religion, jurisprudence. Now, isn't that interesting? Religion, jurisprudence, rumors, messengers. Okay, here's rumors, messengers, and movement in place. Now, there's rumors. Now, we didn't see it with Valens, we didn't see it with Ptolemy, but we do start to see it here with Abu Mashar. So, and this is 8th century, maybe 8th, 9th century, 7th century even. So that's interesting to see. Now, with religion, we look at religion because what? The 9th house is God, right? And the 9th house represents kind of the conventional religion, like Christianity is the major religion, and then the third house would represent sects. And when we look at Al-Kabizi, who we're going to look at next, we're actually going to come to that, I think. I'm pretty sure he did mention it. No, maybe not. Okay, third house, brothers and sisters, kinsmen, those who are esteemed. Now, you know, we talk about friendships, and I know those of you who've been with me for a while will know that I often say that I think that the third house represents friends who are like family. For instance, think about your best friends from high school. Your best friends from high school have more than likely been in your house growing up. You've more than likely been in their house growing up. They know your siblings. They know your parents. They know your situation at home. I had a very difficult upbringing with my parents, and all of my friends in high school knew about that. And when I later ran into some of them 15 years later, 20 years later, how's your mother? Oh, she died? Wow, you must be happy. Whatever, but you know, wow, everybody fully understood we all knew each other's situations. So I find that people who, you know, and also when you talk about your friends are your chosen family, right? Your chosen family. When we get to the people who we love like our chosen family, that's third house, not necessarily 11th house. I mean, one can use the 11th house for friends, and that's absolutely fine. But I myself think of the third house more as like your besties, your absolute best friends who like in the African American community, you often would see people say, "Oh, she's my cousin," but they say, "Well, she's not really my cousin, but she's my cousin." Right, so that's kind of the thing. It's like that this person is so close to me that I've made them family. That's third house. Here's this commands and legates, right? So messengers and legates. So that is connected. Now we also see legates in the 5th house, messengers and legates in the 5th house, and diplomats we see them in the fifth. So I think this is interesting. Changes in short journeys. And the third house and the sixth house are both connected to moving house often, right? So person, and actually there was a really interesting chart in Reddit months ago where a guy asked, he said, why is it that I'm moving around all the time? Because really, I can never stay in a house in one home for maybe more than 6 months or 3 months or something, and then I'm moving to another thing. And he had all kinds of shit going on with the sixth house. I thought it was mostly the sixth that I saw it, and that's often where you'll see moving from house to house or moving from place to place. But also noting that short journeys is the third house. So it's journeys by land, journeys to familiar places. So often you'll see if somebody is going to visit a friend, it will be often a third house thing, or you're taking any kind of short journey, or really any journey on the road, then you would see that kind of thing. Signifies the condition of life before death, right? Remember that Alcabisi said that the fifth house was the condition of life after death, or rather your reputation after death, and the third house, now he's saying, is the condition of life right before. And then when we look at the triplicity rulers, the first lord of the triplicity of the house of brothers is your older brothers, the second one the middle, and the third one the youngest. Now here's the interesting thing, is that when we come to Bonatti, which we're going to do next, essentially the third house is your younger siblings, and that's also the same for Jyotish. And their worthiness will be according to their places. And here we come to Bonatti. And Saul, there we go. It was Saul, not Alcabisi. Now, Saul is Persian and is earlier than Alcabisi. So this is interesting. Saul said that signifies contention in sects, letters and dreams. Oh, that was, and see, that's interesting too, because I did this interesting thing with Benjamin Dykes. So Benjamin Dykes had an interesting lecture that I was listening to on the ninth house, and he did connect the third house to dreams, even though Lily in Christian astrology connects the ninth house to dreams. So I think that that's very interesting. But here we do see letters and dreams, and it signifies all sects and heretics. And it signifies blood relatives and relations who hold him as their elder, there, see, and who revere him and obey him, and those who are lesser than him. So the lesser, so the younger, the lesser than him in riches and power and wisdom. That's something that we haven't ever used it for. And who consult him in their affairs and their necessities. So subordinate, there's like an element of subordination in the third house as per Bonatti. And really, he's the only one. Now, remember, Bonatti is the collector of all the astrological wisdom, right? He's the one that, he's the one that collects it all and then says, hey, everybody says this, but I say this. So now we've got him kind of adding his own little twist on things. And those who are lesser than him in riches and power and wisdom, people who are subordinate to the native and who consult him in their affairs and their necessities, and who often want to handle their own affairs based on his advice and help. So here's also the connection between advice, rumors, etc., and the third house. Whence, if a question arose about someone of the above, said, you always ought to give the third house to him and the acquirent. So isn't that interesting? So there, often, you see people asking questions about, oh, me and this person or whatever. And so it might be interesting to think, well, what's the relationship? Not just what is the relationship, like, is he your brother? Is he your friend? Is he your boyfriend or whatever? But where in the power dynamic are you? Are you the more powerful person? Are they the more powerful person? And then if that's the case, you could use the third house, possibly, based on this. Here's Schöner, who we've just started introducing. Schöner is 15th century or late 15th, early 16th century. And third house for him is called goddess. So still we've got that going on, from which we prophesy about brothers, sisters, relatives, in-laws. Back to in-laws, neighbors. Here's our first look at neighbors. Shorter journeys, hospitality. And so third house is the house of hospitality, the moon, because the moon is welcome. Moon is about welcoming and connectivity, and so definitely that's a very interesting thing. And also being neighborly, right? Being neighborly. There's a term in India, Atiti Devo Bhava. Atiti Devo Bhava. It means that a guest is God in your home, right? So that's kind of this third house hospitality thing. Shoulders, arms, and hands makes sense. And look, Mars is the co-significator. So we're still kind of reaching back to the through to the tradition, through the Arabic tradition. And now here's Lily, where things start to break down just a little. So it signifies brethren, sisters, cousins, or kindred, neighbors, small journeys or inland journeys, often moving from one place to another. Okay, there we have the moving from one place to another. But now we come to epistles and letters, rumors and messengers. Now we saw rumors and messengers already. It doth rule the shoulders, arms, hands, and fingers. Makes sense. Co-significators of the signs Gemini of the planets Mars, which is one reason why Mars in this house, unless joined with Saturn, is not very unfortunate. It is a Caden house, and it's the joy of the moon. For if she be posited therein, especially in a movable sign, it's an argument of much travel, trotting and trudging, or being seldom quiet. That's interesting. The house is masculine. That's an interesting thing. We'll apply that to Mae West when we get to her. And then this is the first time that I see anything about twins. Often on Reddit, you will see people saying, "Hey, I'm a twin. How do you tell the difference?" Or how do you know if somebody's going to have twins? Or how do you make a distinction? Now, this doesn't say anything about making a distinction between twin people people who are twins and their own natal charts. This really is talking more about how you distinguish whether or not the native will have twins, will beget twins, right there. The native will beget twins. And so I find this really interesting because what he's doing is what is very, very common in Vedic astrology, which is that you don't just look at everything from the ascendant. You look at the chart from using the ascendant, using the moon as the ascendant. So it's called the Chandra Lagna. Lagna is the term for ascendant. So you use what's called the Janma Lagna, which is your birth ascendant. You use the Chandra Lagna, which is the moon is ascendant, and then you use the Surya Lagna, which is using the sun as an ascendant. And so those are three different charts that you use. And so he's basically saying the same thing. He says, if you can see from all three places that this is going to happen, then more than likely the person will have twins. For if all of these places and their lords, or the greater part of them occupied by corporeal signs or common signs, right? Those are Gemini, Virgo, Pisces, Sagittarius, the native will beget twins. And insofar as the greater part of the signs of the aforesaid three places are by corporeal, and also most of the planets which have dominion in those places, especially if Mercury is the dispositor of said places and has an aspect with most of them in accordance with this native, will also give birth to many children. So it can be not just twins, but also a proliferation of children. Now, this is only the first paragraph. He goes on for quite a while. This comes from Scherner's, it's on nativities. It's basically Scherner's book on nativities. And it's very detailed. It's very detailed with lots of different aphorisms. So it's worth kind of looking at. So we're almost done with our significations. As you can see, there's not a whole lot that's that different, even when we come to Lily. So we start with Bonatti, or we start with Ptolemy in the 2nd century and Valens in the 2nd century, and we come 1,500 years later to the 17th century with Lily, and things are pretty much similar, except that now Lily has started creeping in the zodiac alphabet bullshit. Anyway, so now we can look at the lots. There are 3 parts as per Bonatti. So there are 2 parts of brothers. Oh, actually, the first part is the part of brothers. The second part is the number, represents the number. And then the third part is the death of brothers and sisters, right? So I would say more than likely, even though it says part of brothers, it says pars fratrum, so it definitely means brothers. There is not a part that's specifically for sisters. And so there would more than likely be a way of realizing whether or not it's going to be a brother or a sister, maybe based on what planet it is, etc. And generally that's the case when we're looking at things, right? When we're looking at anything, we're looking for children, we're looking for feminine signs or feminine planets or feminine degrees. Same thing probably for the 3rd house and the lots of the 3rd house. And let's see, it's Saturn to Jupiter. Oh, Saturn to Jupiter, which is the opposite of the part of children. So and it's day and night. That's interesting. So it's day and night from Saturn to Jupiter. The part of children is by day Jupiter to Saturn, by night Saturn to Jupiter. So this is purely from Saturn to Jupiter. And I wonder why that might be, why he would choose those two things. But it's interesting that Saturn is the most what's the word? Most superior planet, right? He's the heaviest, he's the slowest. And remember that the superior planets are Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And then Jupiter is next, right? Jupiter is the planet that's next in superiority. And so remembering what Bonatti just said about the third house would be connected to anybody who is kind of under you. And so here we have Saturn and Jupiter as that which is under you. So it's interesting, he didn't use Mars at all. Didn't use Mars at all as a significator for brothers. He used Saturn and Jupiter. So I find that very interesting. And here is Schörner again, basically saying what you should look at if you're looking for brothers, or if you're looking for siblings. So Saturn, the sun, and the first triplicity lord of the third for elder, right? Because of course, that's exactly what Bonatti says. Jupiter, Mars, and the second triplicity, look there. Look at that, Saturn and Jupiter. So Saturn, if you're looking for the elder sibling, so Saturn is always the elder, right? Saturn is always things that are old, things that are older. So Saturn is the elder, Jupiter is next to him. So Jupiter is the middle, and then Venus, Mercury. So we're so Saturn, Sun, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercury, and the third triplicity lord of the third for younger siblings. The third house, obviously, its lord, the almutin of the significator of siblings, which we're going to look at next. The co-significator of the third, which is always Mars. And look at how this person's like, what? And the first triplicity lord of the third house. Now you can tell that this person is coming from a modern standpoint. They don't know shit about the Chaldean order. They don't know shit about traditional astrology. They're obviously just learning because they're surprised that Mars is connected to the third house. And then the first triplicity of the lord of the third house, which is the elder sibling, the part of siblings, which we just looked at, and its lord. So these would be all the things that you would look at to figure out if the person has siblings, what the sibling might be like, whether the sibling is older or younger, etc. Mutant of siblings. So last week when we looked at, was it last week? No, it was the week before when we finally kind of got our shit together around the significator of substance, money and wealth and inheritance. We looked at using the almutin, using the compound almutin, right? So you could look at any of these things singularly and look at the essential dignity of each thing, or you can use all of these together and create an almutin of all of those points at one time. And we found, and generally, I found 2 weeks ago that the technique that Bonatti created for finding the significator of wealth was more effective necessarily than this one. But not that this wasn't effective at all, but that that I felt that it was better. So those are all the things that we would do. Cusp of the third house, its lord. So if my third house is Pisces, then it would be 5 degrees Pisces, and Jupiter at 24 Gemini, then Mars, who is at 7 Aquarius, and then Saturn, who's the ruler of Aquarius, right? So it would be all of those points, and then as we talked about, we would basically list all of the degrees in which these things are. So we would list the degree of the third house in whatever sign it's occupying. Same thing for its lord, same thing for Mars and his lord, same thing for the first triplicity lord of the third. And, so all three. So he's using all three in this case, and then same thing for the part of siblings and its lord. All right. Any questions about that before we go to charts? So I have a few really interesting charts here. I've got, what I thought I'd start with first, though, is the chart of Joan Fontaine and Olivia De Havilland. And the reason I chose them, now Joan Fontaine and Olivia De Havilland are Oscar-winning actresses of the first part of the 20th century. Now Olivia De Havilland just died recently at 104. And I think Joan Fontaine was in her 90s. But the reason I'm using that is because Joan Fontaine and Olivia De Havilland are sisters. Not only that, but Joan Fontaine and Olivia De Havilland stopped speaking to each other. They were in this feud that I think lasted for the rest of their life. And I think it's because one of them stole a man from the other. So I thought it might be interesting to look at these two charts. First of all, they are screen goddesses. They are movie screen goddesses. And as you see, we've got Marilyn Monroe, Greta Garbo, Betty Davis, Grace Kelly. I put Grace Kelly in here because Grace Kelly was not just a screen goddess. She became the Queen of Monaco. She married the Prince of Monaco. Right, so she became a princess, and third house is connected to what's the word I'm looking for? To queendom, right? So hold on just one second. I'm looking for just one thing. Okay. So what we're going to look at first, let's look at Joan Fontaine. We're going to basically one of the usual things for anything. Usual rules for anything is that when you're looking to see what the relationship is between a person and anything, okay, so what's the relationship between you and your children? What's the relationship between you and your wife? What's the relationship between you and either parent? Then you're looking to see what the connection is between the ruler of the first house and the ruler of whatever house it is that's connected, that we're talking about. Also, oh, looks like we got a question. Thank you. Yes, I keep forgetting that I actually have to click on the chart to share it. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so remembering that we're talking about a screen goddess, look at where the moon and the part of fortune are. So the moon and the part of fortune are both in the third house. And look at where the ruler of the third is. The ruler of the third is in the 10th. So now, is there any connection between Venus, who's the ruler of the first, and Saturn, who is ruler of the third? Now, interestingly enough, there's a trine. So we would expect that there would be a good relationship between them, right? However, the Saturn is in detriment. The Saturn and Venus are enemies. So I think that's, and one of the things that we tend to notice when Venus is in any kind of connection to Saturn is that he has a tendency to impede her ability to be fully amorous, right? So because Saturn is super cold, he tends to chill her down. You know, he tends to chill her down, maybe, and he can make people frigid. He can corrupt a person's sexuality. He can make a person asexual, etc. So all of these things that Venus, all of the kind of things that Venus is known for, Saturn can really put the kibosh on. And so there's a connection between the first and the third, and that might represent, shall we say, that could also represent the, that could represent the screen goddess thing, right? Because notice how the light, lights, camera, action, there's the sun. So let's look at the first triplicity ruler So unfortunately, it looks like the first triplicity ruler is Venus. So it's the same planet. So it's not really that particularly useful in this particular chart. Now let's look at the part of siblings. So it's Saturn to the moon, Saturn to Jupiter. So, and that goes backwards 60 and backwards another 3. So backwards 60 and backwards another 3. So backwards 60, we're at 28 Libra, or 29 Libra, which brings us to 29 Libra. And look at how the part of siblings is right on this Mars. It brings us to like 26 degrees of Libra. Now, notice how the Saturn and the Mars are on the part of siblings. Now, of course, the Mars is conjuncting it within 3 degrees, but we tend to use these in a whole sign fashion, meaning that, or rather I tend to, meaning that as a result, Saturn and Mars would be on this part of siblings. So interestingly enough, even though the chart itself doesn't show, because Olivia De Havilland is her older sister, even though the chart itself doesn't really show on the extrovert level or on the overt level that there's a problem with the sibling, looking at what's going on with the part of siblings, we come to understand that, oh, hey, Mars and Saturn, what, did the sibling die? Or is there some kind of disaster or calamity? Indeed, there was a calamity, and the sibling is dead to this person. Let's look at Olivia De Havilland now. Okay, looking at Olivia De Havilland. So looking for the third house ruler, notice how the third house ruler is within 5 degrees of the ascendant. And on the part of fortune. So once again, there's this connection with visibility, with life paths, etc., and the third house. And we're going to see this with all of the screen goddesses, all of them. We're going to see it with Betty Davis. We will see it with Betty Davis. We will see it with Katharine Hepburn. We will see it with Marilyn Monroe. We will see it with Greta Garbo, that the third house is an important thing, and often the part of fortune is involved. Last week, when we were looking at Mars, we looked at the chart of George Washington. And George Washington had a Taurus rising with Venus in Pisces. However, he had an Aries part of fortune with Saturn right on it. And if you know any of those kind of portraits of George Washington, and if you know anything about George Washington almost never smiled. He was a very, very serious, pensive person. And he was a general. And one of the things that you see in Vettius Valens, and you also see it even with Bonatti, is they often say that the part of fortune shows up more in notable nativities. And so that it's on some level, it ends up kind of taking precedence over the regular chart, in kind of the way that when we were talking, I think we were talking last week about the difference between the ascendant and the 10th house, the ascendant being kind of the essence of who you are and what is visible to us, but the 10th house being the works by which you are known and your reputation. So for instance, let's say you've got a very quiet, a sweet, quiet girl who bullies decide to spread a rumor that she's a slut, and she gets a rumor that she's a slut. She isn't one, right? She's the sweet, quiet girl. That would be her ascendant. But her reputation is that she's a slut. And that would be her 10th house. That would be this, whatever kind of negative thing is happening to her 10th house. So as far as the part of fortune is concerned, as I mentioned before, one of the things I noticed when I started working was I'm not like a particularly Virgoan person. Like I'm not, my part of fortune's in Virgo. Like I don't like to clean the house. I don't like to keep things really super organized. However, the minute I get into a professional situation, I'm organizing, I'm writing lists, I'm putting everything in its place, I'm taking care of efficiency. Like I remembered noticing that and being like, where the fuck does this come from? It's like, this isn't me. Where did I get all this? Where did I get this kind of natural propensity towards organization in my professional life? And it really came, in my opinion, from the part of fortune. That's right. You've got the part of fortune, I think, in Virgo too, don't you? All right. So let's look at the third house and the first house. So Mercury is the ruler. Oh, look there. Mercury is the ruler of the first. And look at how Mercury and Mars are almost an exact, almost to the minute. There's just 1 minute of separation between Mercury and Mars. And if I'm not mistaken, it was Joan Fontaine who stole Olivia De Havilland's man. And it was Olivia De Havilland who stopped speaking. Would somebody look that up for me? Look up Olivia De Havilland and see, because I'm almost positive it was Olivia De Havilland who stopped speaking to Joan Fontaine. So that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Now, the next thing we would do is we would look for the second triplicity ruler of the sibling that's directly under them. They're only a year apart. As a matter of fact, it looks like they might not even be a full year. And the second triplicity ruler of the third house is Mars. So it looks like this is the one who got mad at the sibling. Right, this is the one who got mad at the sibling. And now we can see that the Mars Saturn that we saw on the part of siblings was talking about Olivia, right? But we can see in this chart that there's a problem between me and my sibling. Let's look at the part of siblings. So that would be Saturn to Jupiter. And so we'd go back 60 and back another 18. So back 60 is to 23 and then 18, so 5 degrees of Cancer. So 5 degrees of Cancer, and look at, we have all this stuff on it, including Saturn, right? So including Saturn, we've got the moon, we've got the Pluto, we've got the Venus, we've got the Saturn, right? So I think that I'm positive that it's Joan Fontaine who stole Olivia De Havilland's man. I'm positive that that's the case. But if somebody would be kind enough to look it up for me, I will. I would be. I'm going to actually do it right now. Havilland. Let's see. I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause the chat. Pause the thing for just 1 second.
Oh, the website's not opening.
What'd you say?
The website that you just sent, it's not opening for me. So probably that's why.
Oh, okay. Oh, maybe Pakistan won't let you.
Yeah.
Okay. Really? Okay, so interesting to see problems with the sibling, problems with the younger sibling, right? Because the third house, as per Bonatti, the third house is your younger sibling, and it was also, and the third, and Mars is the second triplicity ruler, which represents a younger sibling. So there's problems with a younger sibling in this chart. And then also, once again, we had found that the ruler of the actual ruler of siblings, or the part of siblings, was in Cancer with the stellium, or shall we call it we'll call it an assembly. And it's really only an assembly between the sun and Saturn, which makes perfect sense. So this assembly is part of the problem. And looking at the fact that basically we've got Venus and the moon, both of those planets are combusted, which means that the ruler of the part of siblings is combusted and very close to Saturn. So, and look at how Venus is there too. So I think that makes a lot of sense. That shows us quite a bit as far as I'm concerned. I think that's a very interesting thing. Let's see. So new share. Coming back. So I thought we'd look at the Menendez brothers for a second, because the Menendez brothers killed their father. The father was extremely abusive, including sexually. And when they were in their mid-20s or something, they ended up murdering him. And so what I'm wondering is, I don't know if it would be quite as easy to see in this particular case that a murder of the father necessarily, but certainly problems with the father, we should be able to see. So first of all, let's look at the ruler of the chart is Mercury, and notice how Mercury is in detriment in the fourth house, which is father. Notice also how the ruler of the fourth, Jupiter, is very close, even though it's separating, is close to the moon. Notice also how the Jupiter moon is opposing the Saturn. So this gives us some kind of idea of the negative effect of the father. And of course, and of because these guys were kind of parallels. First of all, Menendez was very, very wealthy. And he used the money to basically not allow them any choices. They couldn't move out of the house. They didn't have a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? They didn't have a lot of independence. And they couldn't really extract themselves from the father. And so here we see this detrimented Mercury in the house of the father. So the person's not empowered, disempowered. And then we see the moon is in fall, and the Jupiter is with it, right? So that also disempowers the moon, or kind of, shall we say, overpowers the moon. The Jupiter overpowers the moon, and then the Saturn gives this tinge of negativity as well. Let's look at the connection between the first and the third. Notice that the Mercury is applying to Mars, who's the ruler of the third house. So Mercury is applying to Mars. So they work together to murder him. And let's look at the death of the father, right? So what would we look at to find the death of the father? In order to find the death of the father, we would look at the 8th from the 4th. I think it's pretty clear that the father is represented by the 4th house in this chart. It's nighttime. Oh, interesting. It's nighttime. So Saturn is also the universal significator. And we've got that separating opposition between Jupiter representing the fourth house and Saturn as representing the father. So the eighth from the father is the moon. Notice how the Jupiter is there. So the father and the moon are together, right? The Jupiter, the father, and the moon are together. And then we've got the Mars and the Mercury sextiling each other and working together. And notice also that the Mercury is in the sign ruled by the moon. I wouldn't be surprised if it was Eric's idea. And I think Eric, I think was the more, he's not the older, but I think he was the more, what's the word I'm looking for? Not superior, but I think he was the kind of the head of the two of them. Was the one who had the idea to do it and told them to do it. If someone wants to check with me on that as well, that would be fine. And then let's look at Lyle, his older brother. So there should be a problem with the father. So fourth house is father. There, and look at how the moon is exalted in the first house. Oh, there's something else that I've thought about looking at, but we'll come back to it after we look at all the others. So you notice, you know how sometimes there are in families, if you have charts of people in your family, you'll note that there's often a signature that everybody has. Sometimes it can be like one planet, everybody has the same planet in the same sign, or sometimes everybody has something in, yes, Christopher, so yeah, or somebody has, similar, or there's similar connections or something. So when we finish with this, we'll come back and we'll look at it from that standpoint. Note that the Jupiter rules the eighth. So maybe it was Lyle that was, Jupiter rules the eighth. Notice that the eighth is on the part of fortune. The ruler of the eighth is on the part of fortune, and the ruler of the ascendant is in the eighth. So I'm probably wrong. More than likely, Lyle was the one who instigated the murder of the father and who was in charge. But look at how the ruler of the ascendant, both rulers of the ascendant are in Sagittarius, right? So we just looked at Eric, the ruler of his ascendant, he was Virgo rising. Note that the part of fortune is in Virgo. All of this stuff is in Virgo. So part of fortune is in Virgo here. It was Virgo rising for Eric. Eric's chart ruler was in Sagittarius, and Lyle's chart ruler is in Sagittarius. Let's look at the father again. So moon, right? Oh, now we see that the moon is that there's this exaltation for the moon. So this moon is very, very strong, and it's in the first house. So that would give it the ability to kind of be on the person's head. It would be a prominent in the person's life. It would be, extremely prominent father would make this. Now, of course, when we look at the moon, we think mother, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Let's look at the part of the father to get a better idea. So that would be Sun to Saturn. It's daytime. That's forward 90 minus 13. forward 90 minus 13. Okay, so forward 90 is to Cancer. And is it backward? Oh, I said forward 90 backwards 13. Sorry, I should forward 90 backwards 13. So backwards 13 from 8 is what? Back 10 is 28, back another is 25. So that should be 25 degrees of Gemini. So where's the Mercury? There's the Mercury up there in Capricorn. So maybe the Saturn is the ruler of the father. But considering how much power the father had over them, I don't think so. I wouldn't say so. But look at how the father is way up there. And so now let's look at the death of the father. Notice that the Saturn is the ruler of the death of the father. Is there any connection between the son, the two brothers? Oh, is there any connection between the two brothers? We're looking at Mercury. Now, this is one of those charts where there's an interception, so that ultimately the actual fourth house is the sun, is Leo, and is the sun, and he's up there on the midheaven. He's up there on the midheaven. So that also kind of gives us some more information. And then we also said what the part of father was in Gemini, and there is Mercury. So Mercury, so we could probably use these two as specific significators for the father. And then who's our chart ruler? And who's our part of fortune? Part of fortune's in Virgo. Mercury is up there, and he's also the part of the father. He's also the ruler of the part of father, and he's also with the sun, who's the natural significator for father and is the ruler of the natural fourth house. What's up with this Jupiter on the part of fortune? Jupiter is the ruler of the 8th and the 11th. So that's why I'm thinking that it was Lyle who thought about killing Daddy, because Jupiter is in the 8th, and this Venus, the Venus is in a separating square from the Jupiter, and this Venus is indeed in the 8th as well. Is there a connection between the moon and the Venus? No. Is there a connection between the Mercury and the Venus? No. So I find that, oh, who's the second triplicity ruler of the 3rd house? It's daytime, so it would be Mercury. So no. So this, it's interesting how, so isn't it interesting? When we were looking at Joan Fontaine's chart, certain things weren't really that prevalent. Then we looked at Olivia De Havilland, and boom, there it was. Same thing in this chart. Some things were much more prevalent in the Eric Menendez chart than in the Lyle Menendez chart. But like I said, death and difficulty, death and terror and horror. Remember that it's terror and horror, you know, and also incarceration and jail. Both of these guys went to jail for forever. Both of these guys are in jail for life. So let's look at our 12th house stuff. Mars is in the 11th. Ain't really touching anybody. Oh, yes, he is. He's applying to the Jupiter here, who's with the part of fortune. That's interesting. Jupiter is the ruler of the 8th. Could that be going to jail for death, for something death related, right? So, and remember, we've already talked about how 4th, 8th, and 12th represent different aspects of it. What was it? Capture is the 4th, incarceration is the 8th, and the actual place of the jail is the 12th. Fallen Saturn in the 12th as well. Absolutely. I was just about to come to that. Right. So we've got that fallen Saturn in the 12th as well. And is anybody, oh, well, look, and the Venus is trining it, but separating, but trining. And this, oh, no, not the Jupiter is not. Okay. So that's about it. Looks like the only applying aspect in this chart is Mars, Jupiter. And we know that Mars and Jupiter are also enemies. Those are things to kind of keep in mind. Oh, wait, Moon to Mercury as well. No, oh, no, remember the ruler of the part of father is Mercury, and then the ruler of the 4th is Moon. And note how they are in trine here. So there's that connection, this very prominent dad. This father was very, very wealthy, very prominent, and very overpowering. And so we've got that connection. So it's important not to, some people tend to think, oh, well, as a matter of fact, I was just talking to some people, and they were talking about father for 4th versus father for 10th. And one guy was saying that he tended to find that the 4th house represented the father for women, and the 10th house represented the father for men. Right. So he thought that it was opposite. That it was so that for a woman, the 4th house was father. For a man, the 10th house was father. But those of you who remember Davik has Cancer. Davik has Aries rising with Cancer on the 4th house. And when I asked him what his relationship with his father, he said, it waxes and wanes. There we go. So interesting. So just interesting things to kind of look at in these charts. Let's now look at the third. Any questions about that? Let's now look at a few goddess charts. You know, we're kind of far beyond, we're kind of, as far as time is concerned, we're kind of far beyond the influence of Marilyn Monroe on popular culture. But even when I was a kid, up until the 80s and early 90s, Marilyn Monroe was one of the most kind of ubiquitous, enigmatic, and important cultural icons of the entire century. Like, she was humongous. You know, the fact that she had, quote, committed suicide. I mean, just there was so much, this whole Marilyn Monroe thing, people were so into her, and she was so huge. She was so important. She was so, so tragic, so important, so huge. And her influence on American culture, especially, was gigantic. It was just gigantic. first of all, look at how the Venus is with the part of fortune. What house does Venus rule in this chart? She rules the third house. Look at the third house from the part of fortune. Note that there is the ruler of the third from the part of fortune and the sun. Now it's a combust connection, but having those two there together, think about the blood. Marilyn Monroe wasn't raised blonde, right? She wasn't born blonde. She was born a redhead. Remember? So notice, so the sun can give the yellowing, right? The sun can yellow things, and in order to become a goddess, she had to yellow. She had to goldenize or yellow. And so third house is goddess. Now let's see, okay, so that's kind of what I'm talking about. We're going to see it with all of them. So this kind of either the third house on the part of fortune, or the third house in the ruler of the third in the first house, or the third from the part of fortune, or the third from the ascendant being really important. We will see it consistently. We already looked at Olivia De Havilland and Joan Fontaine and saw it. Here's, oh wait, not this one, Betty Davis. Okay. Here's Betty Davis, who's probably considered one of the greatest or the most important. So let's see, this one might not be quite as much. Let's see. Saturn represents, isn't that interesting? Saturn represents the third house, or is the ruler of the third, and so is Mars. Notice how the third from the part of fortune is the ascendant, and we've got the Mars here opposing the opposing the first house generally. So in an angle, the Saturn is in the fifth. Oh, the Saturn is in the seventh from the part of fortune. No, it's not. Sorry about that. No, it's not. But the Saturn is in the fifth, also with the sun, or approaching the sun, or the sun is leaving it, thankfully. So this one, not so much, huh? This one doesn't kind of point to it quite as much as I thought it would. This is a chart I hadn't looked at prior. I just kind of brought it down for today. but when we look at Greta Garbo, and actually one of the things about Betty Davis is Betty Davis was she was highly successful, and she could definitely be considered kind of a screen goddess, but she wasn't idealized or mythologized in the same kind of way that somebody like a Greta Garbo or a Marilyn Monroe was. And I think that's kind of an important point, or that might just be rationalizing why this chart doesn't fit the bill or whatever. But she was very New England, very kind of salt of the earth, super practical, a real stevedore, a real kind of sargenta, a real sergeant. So not really goddess material, or what we think of as God. She was glamorous without being really beautiful. So maybe Betty Davis doesn't fully fit this idea of a screen goddess, even though she was. I mean, the most important screen goddesses of the 20th century are Betty Davis, Joan Crawford, and more than likely Greta Garbo, Katharine Hepburn, Marilyn Monroe. Let's look at Katharine Hepburn and see if there's any third house stuff, or Grace Kelly. Well, let's skip her and come back. Oh, I didn't put them in. Hold on 1 second. I'm gonna pause it. You remember where I stopped? Where did I stop? Was it when I was looking for Greta Garbo, or was when I was looking for?
Yeah, when you were turning the chart from the Placidus to whole signs house, that's where you had stopped.
For whom? For Greta Garbo? Okay, so let's go back to Greta Garbo. Here we go. So and so we were, as I said, I don't really like looking at these far northern charts and what happens. So I tend to revert them or convert them to whole sign. And so, as we were saying, just to bring it back in, the sun is the ruler of the third in this chart, which doesn't really seem to show very much. But when we look from the part of fortune, Jupiter is the ruler of the third, and it's in the ascendant. And so that's one of the things that makes a lot of sense to me. And then the fact that also the ruler of the first and the ruler of the third are together, and the ruler of the first is exalted. So basically the ruler of the third is working for the ruler of the first. Mercury is still outside of the rays of the sun, 18 degrees away. So not yet under the rays. So the sun is really is still working for Mercury and not yet able to fuck it over with its effects. So I think that's an interesting thing. And then the fact that the ruler of the third from the part of fortune is in the ascendant is what we were looking at. And next we were going to go to Judy Garland and look at her whole sign chart because she's also from a far north longitude. And the ruler of the third from the ascendant is Mercury, and there he is in the first house. And the ruler of the third from the part of fortune is Jupiter. And Jupiter is involved with, and look at how Jupiter is with the ruler of the part of fortune. So and notice how also we were talking about this when we looked at the part of fortune, that Jupiter and Saturn is exalted. So we have an exalted part of fortune, and Saturn is with the Jupiter, who's the ruler of the third, culminating in the 10th house from the part of fortune. So that's a very, very auspicious placement. When you have the ruler of the part of fortune, or especially when you have the ruler of the part of spirit, or the ruler of the exaltation, or some of those other things, when you have those in the 10th from the part of fortune, that tends to represent, kind of getting to the height of the career. So the third from the ascendant is Mercury, and note, like I said, she was part of a sister act. She herself was part of a sister act, and worked with her sisters as well. So the last thing I want to do, what I want to do next is I want to bring up, I want to show you a video. I'm going to stop the share. I'm going to stop the recording of the share. Okay, so the reason I put Ella Fitzgerald back, brought Ella Fitzgerald back, is because Ella Fitzgerald came to fame singing for the Chick Webb Orchestra. We've talked about her quite a bit, about how she started as, how she started out as kind of a street urchin right before she was discovered, before she did the Apollo talent contest, had been living pretty much on the street, was a numbers runner for racketeers, was a lookout for whorehouses, basically a vagrant kid. And then after she was kind of discovered at the Apollo Theater, she was brought to Chick Webb, and Chick Webb ended up hiring her. And so I just want you to see what her touring life was like in 1937. Now, Ella Fitzgerald kept up this touring routine, and it, of course, expanded to all over the world for almost her entire life. She stayed on the road all the time. And her son even talks about the fact that she'd come home, and then within 2 weeks of being at home, she was already antsy to get back to the road. She herself couldn't kind of handle not being on the road. Okay, so of course they started in New York, where the Savoy Ballroom was. Right? So noticing, okay, now the Chicago, now back to New York. Baltimore, Richmond. Now we're going south, Atlanta, New Orleans, Fort Worth, Dallas. I mean, do you see this? Think of how grueling this was. This is before people were using planes. All of this was on a bus. It's still going. It's still working. Look at it. It's still going. Look at this. Fucking crazy. Okay. So that is what we're talking about here. That's the kind of road life that we're talking about that Ella Fitzgerald dealt with. Cries of happiness. Wait, your cries of happiness because you wish that were you?
Yeah, all the traveling and just living a nomad-like life.
Well, look at where the part of fortune is. Part of fortune is in the third house.
Can you enlarge the chart?
I have to do it again. Sorry.
Yeah, and yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so look at where the part of fortune is. Third house. On the cusp of the third house. And look at where Venus is, the ruler of the third, right? So this Casimir Venus that we've talked quite a bit about. And so maybe even the Casimir can show maybe the Casimir can even show the extreme, right? So when we talked about Ella Fitzgerald, we've talked about kind of the extremes of laud, or what's the word I'm looking for, of accolades, the extreme accolades, the extreme, like, she, all of the honors she received, the extreme honors, the extreme accolades, the extreme respect that she had from everybody else in the business, right? I told you that I was listening to a recording of hers, a live recording, and the person comes out and says, simply the best. Ladies and gentlemen, simply the best, Ella Fitzgerald, right? I mean, so, and I also told you when I was looking at that Kennedy Center honors thing, it was her, Aaron Copland, the most important American composer, Tennessee Williams, the most important American playwright, her, Martha Graham, the creator of modern dance, right? So a giant, a titan. And so we were a titan in the field of entertainment. And so we see that with the Venus Casimir, but could it also represent all of the being on the road as well?
Mm-hmm.
So it could also show the extent, like I said, her son said that she could barely stand to stay home for 2 weeks. The minute, at a certain point, he said he could see it. He could see it, or she'd be so happy when she got home and she'd relax and everything. And then he said, I could start to see in her eyes that she was missing the road. And sure enough, before you knew it, she was off on the road one more time. And we're talking somebody who sometimes was on the road for as much as 50 weeks a year. 50 weeks a year. Think about that. So I just found that really, really fascinating and thought that would be something to look at. Now, the next chart is the chart of Willie Nelson, who wrote a song called On the Road Again. I just can't wait to get on the road again. Look at where his part of fortune is. And look at where his Venus is. Now, it doesn't have a Casimir Venus. And so he doesn't have the acclaim that the Ella Fitzgerald. Nobody says Willie Nelson is simply the best or anything like that. But we can see the same thing, that the road, right? The road itself is elevated. The same thing as in Ella's chart, the road itself is elevated. And note, the other thing I want to look at is the Mercury. Note how the Mercury is in the ninth, on the cusp of the ninth, which is long distance travel. Mercury represents travel and roads. And in Ella's chart, the Mercury is in the 10th, in the same sign as the Venus. And note how the Mars is the ruler of the ninth, and he's in the ninth house, right? So this is a travel chart. This Ella Fitzgerald chart is a travel chart, and a chart that spent all this time on the road. And it looks like Willie Nelson himself spent a lot of time on the road and enjoyed being on the road. And note, oh wow, there's not a Casimir Venus, but there is a Casimir Venus, but there is a Combus Venus here, even though she's separating from it. The sun is close. And the sun is also the ruler of the ascendant. Isn't that interesting? Two singers that couldn't be any more different. That's so fascinating. We've still got this Venus-Sun connection. We've got a Leo rising. We've got the part of fortune in Libra. So I think that this is kind of a fascinating thing to kind of look at, to be looking at this particular point. I'm going to stop the recording.